closed variation, bishop e7 with one. Threatening to win the pawn on e5, black played d5, bishop to d3.
D6. Does anyone know what black is threatening here, basically? Positional threat after d6? What's that? Yeah, so knight a5, exactly. I'm trying to get a sense of what people's level is rating, because I don't know. I hope I'm not speaking over people or anything. It's not. The Ruy Lopez is mostly like, how many people have seen this position before? It's just, okay. So I'm just trying to get an estimate. Okay, so knight a5 is a threat, positional threat to take this bishop, because this bishop is very important in the Spanish, and we're going to see that in this game. So white played c3, keeping the bishop, preparing to retreat it if black attacks with knight a5, and also preparing, of course, d4. Now, I guess you guys know this, so that's good. Black castled, and now h3. So preparing d4, he stops the pin. You can play d4 right away, but bishop g4, then black puts pressure in the center. That's another line. This is the main move, h3. White wants to go, I don't know how to make arrows on here, but in any case, white wants to go d2 to d4. And that's inevitable if white wants to. Now black played here, bishop b7. This is the Zaitsev variation. So, well, there's different ways black can play here. This is one of the main ones. Other main one is knight a5 followed by c5. Chigorin variation, where black gets some more control of the center, but okay. And then there's also moves like knight to b8, Bryan, which is because this knight is a little bit poorly placed on c6 right now. So we want to try to fix this. But in any case, in this game, black played bishop b7. The idea of this is sort of kind of a rapid counterattack in various variations against white center after white plays d4. Sometimes with knight b4 after bishop or knight, attacking e4, and rook e8 and bishop f8 is also coming. And the knight on c6 doesn't necessarily go to b8. It can go in some variations to b4 still. So here, Gligorich chose the less common move d3. d4 is the main move, but he plays this move with a whole different conception in mind. He wants to keep a solid center and keep bishop locked out on b7 at least somewhat, and build up the game and maybe d4 later, but also he might build up on the king side. So next is going to come the maneuver knight b1 to d2 to f1, and then to g3 or e3. This normal Spanish maneuver, we need to develop the knight, and then white will go from there. Okay, so in this game, black played used a tempting idea, but I think it's probably not the most promising, as we'll see. But it looks like we'll see us in a second. What's the purpose of this move? What do you think? Can anyone figure out? Yeah.
I think maybe to play f5.
Could be, yeah. I mean, he's going to drive the bishop away, and then maybe f5 could happen in some cases. But basically, yeah, it could end up being f5. But I don't know if it's going to be possible, because knight c5, bishop c2, f5. There's going to be d4, not necessarily d4, but there's some problems with it, let's just say. But yeah, could play f5. But really, his idea is just to drive the bishop away, and then he wants to play d5. So, okay, it looks the position he gets to looks like he's achieved a lot. We'll see in a second. So Gligorich just played knight to d2. Okay, knight's being developed. Knight c5, bishop c2. If you were afraid of d5 here, you might play bishop d5, but I don't think white's going to get to anything there. So he played bishop c2. I mean, sorry, you can't actually play bishop d5, knight d3. But anyway, bishop c2, and now black played d5. Yeah, I'm not sure f5 works, because there's takes and d4 is one problem. Take on f5, and after rook takes, then d4. This is, but d5 was black's idea. On the surface, it would seem that he's, how do I make this the main line, actually? This is going to be a problem. In any case, as long as the position on the board is okay, whereas there's going to be many but it's but okay. D5. It looks like black's achieved a lot. He's got more space. He's he's broken white's. He's made the advance of the D pawn rather than white's normal D4. But we'll see that that there's some things going on in the position that are a little bit hard to explain, but lead to just a decisive attack very quickly for white. And part of the problem is that black has played knight f6, but he moved the knight away from the king side. So his king side is a little bit lacking in defenders. And he also spent a couple of moves with the knight. But at this point, if you look at the board, looks fine for black, right? Okay, white took on d5, the queen took, and now simple knight f1. The knight has to be moved to different square. Again, I don't know, maybe a lot of people might look at this and say black has achieved a lot. Now he plays his perfectly natural rook a to d8. Okay. He's got pressure on d3. In fact, he might even take the pawn. Then to regain the pawn, white has to give up 2 bishops. He's got more space. He doesn't seem to have too many weaknesses. What has white done wrong? Well, white did nothing wrong. And you can't achieve this much normally without some kind of downside. Knight e3, queen to d7, okay. Has to go here. Now, what do you think white plays here? Does anyone have an idea? It looks, again, on the surface, and the Spanish types of positions are pretty deceptive sometimes, because it looks like black has good development, looks like he's got no weaknesses, which you can't really usually get in most openings. And you play the French, you usually have a light squared bishop is bad. Every opening has their downsides. Sicilian, you're behind in development sometimes. But here, nothing. D4. Very good. Yes, D4. It seems a little bit hard to imagine, but well, tactically it works. Knight f5 at the end, right? So black can't take the pawn twice, that is. And he made a decision here, which may seem obvious. All of his play has been geared toward rapid development. He takes over the d file. Of course, he's going to take for the pawn on d4 and leave white with an isolated pawn in the center, and black has all this great development. White's queen side is still not developed. So of course he's going to take on d4, but in reality, this move is, I think, a serious mistake when he took on d4. E takes d4, but this is the most obvious move. Instead, he had one chance to, at least as far as I can see, to avoid catastrophe, and that was to try e4. And here, white has 2 options. Yeah, basically, well, we can go into an endgame by taking on c5, and the queens will be traded. Let's see what happens. D takes c5. Black probably, well, he has to take first on d1, right? Because if he takes on f3, the queen takes back, and then knight f5 is coming, and white has a lot of pieces pointed toward the black king. So he's going to get rid of the queens first. Now black's going to be taking on f3, so we'll want our bishop to take back. So we're going to take with our bishop on d1. Now black has to take the piece back. White takes back on f3. Black takes here, getting his pawn back. It's equal material. And now we want to, when possible, activate our pieces. So what is a natural move for white? Any ideas? Yeah, knight f5, yeah. So then we look at the position. Okay, it's symmetrical pawn structure, but white's a little bit better, right? Knight is more active, first of all, on f5. This knight is pinned on c6 by white's bishop, so you can also say white's bishop is a little bit more active. And maybe black's queenside pawns could come under a little bit of pressure, but it's not that much. Black has chances to neutralize white's initiative. Alternatively, here, you don't have to go into an ending. You can also play knight to d2. Now black's knight is threatened, and if the knight moves back somewhere, well, or to a4, let's say white just takes on e4 and is a pawn up. So black has to play knight to d3, which is a pawn sacrifice. Okay, rook is attacked, so we don't have time to take on e4. We have to take the knight. And black takes back. And now, I guess, knight f3 probably. And white's going to be taking the pawn. Maybe not knight f3. There might be some more subtleties, but in any case, white's going to be taking the pawn on d3, and he'll be up a pawn, but black will have the two bishops. The light squared bishop on the long diagonal. It's worth something here. And black has some compensation. You get sometimes these positions in Spanish as black, the Marshall Gambit and this kind of thing. So I'm not sure which one he would have chosen. It's depends on style. I would prefer the ending with the more active pieces rather than the extra pawn and trying to neutralize the opponent's initiative. But it's everyone has a different. It's hard to say objectively which is better. But in any case, black took on d4. Okay, so pawn takes back. Black knight is under attack. And if black takes the pawn, then because of some small tactics, and now this is, it's because at this point you can't foresee the rest of the game. Gligorich did not calculate to the rest of the game. It's, I don't know how many moves, let's see, about 20, 26, 27 moves. And he didn't calculate to the rest of the game, but he felt his initiative and he was going to take over the game. But of course, has to calculate these small variations, like knight takes d4 doesn't work, but this is pretty obvious. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, rook takes d4, and knight f5. And white just wins the exchange because black has to bishop f6, and then white's just easily winning. So, well, and meanwhile, well, okay, black has some other moves. He can move his queen and pin white's pawn. He could move his knight, but knight moves like knight e6, loses to d5. The knights are forked. If the queen moves away, white just goes bishop d2, and one of the knights will be lost. Knight a4. Again, white can go d5. And now if black tries going forward with his knights over here, he finds that he has lost control of the center and also the king side. So for instance here, knight e5 is very strong. And the queen is under attack. And then here, then we can go knight f5, threatening the bishop. I think bishop f6. Now we have knight to, I believe, g4. And black is, well, his bishop has nowhere to go. So white's just going to get a winning attack. So after d5, black played queen c8. Oh, not here. Sorry. Immediately queen c8 after taking back. Well, he wants to attack white's pawn. It's pinned. He wants to maybe play bishop f6. His knights are jumping in. Knight b4. Again, it may seem obvious now, but I could see a lot of people misjudging the position. What does white play now? A very tricky little move that Gligorich played here that takes over the initiative completely. It's not that easy of a move. Bishop d2. He just started off with his pieces on the third rank, but now they're going to spring forward it almost seems impossible in just a few moves, starting with this little tiny move. Well, now black's knight is really under attack. Black still can't take the pawn on d4 because white will trade knights. Again, knight f5. And again wins means at least the exchange. So knight e6 loses to d5. Knight d7 be met by similar things. Well, d5 and knight f5. It's not going to help black. So black played here knight a4. I guess we played it. Yep. So now continue d5. And black has to move the knight again. Knight to b8. So what now? The black king side is a little bit devoid of defenders. Yeah? Yeah, so we can start with knight f5, continuing to build the initiative with tempo gain. So black has to play bishop f6, but we have to see a little bit, but also our sense that the black king side with no defenders, and we have these two bishops, two knights, and then soon the queen, who will all be attacking, that it should work out. Well, now d5 pawn is lost, I guess, but white's going to continue his attack. So what now? So we burned our bridges a little bit with knight f5, because now we're going to lose the d pawn. But so we need to activate. Bishop is on c2. Okay, it's aiming toward the king side. That's well placed. We need to get our queen in, and we use the knight on f3.
What crazy ideas too?
Yeah, sure. Crazy ideas.
H6?
In h6, I think you can just take it. I don't think it really works.
Can you recapture the qd3?
Bishop takes. Well, he's going to take with a rook on d5, first hitting white's queen, and I think white's attack won't quite work.
Yeah.
But that's a good idea. Also, after knight h6, and we have to realize that black doesn't have to take the knight, but of course he can. So, but that's, yeah. Any other? Our aim is h7, right? Yeah, but queen b1 takes the queen a little far away, and black could play g6, for instance. Knight g5, yeah. So we want to bring our queen up, okay? Black can't take because after bishop takes back, there's a fork on e7 coming up. The rook is under attack and the fork, and also white still has queen h5 coming. So queen h5 is a threat, one of many threats. Also knight h7 is a threat. Just black has to play g6. If he plays h6, then again white can play queen up, right? And we're going to sacrifice on h6. Black can't take the knight on g5 because there's a fork on e7. So, and if pawn takes, anyone see what happens? Knight check on e7, followed by queen h7 mate. And bishop takes, the bishop takes back, and again, he can't take it, and the fork is coming on e7. And meanwhile, knight takes h6 is coming. So for instance, rook takes d5. If he tries to do this, we can just take on h6. Black takes, queen takes, and this bishop on c2. Well, that's the Spanish bishop. So that's, you know, that's the piece that slumbers down there on c2. And it looked like earlier in the game, not very long ago, what was it, 6 or 7 moves ago, white's pieces were only on the 3rd rank, and that bishop was sitting on c2 behind the sort of backward pawn on d3 that black was pressuring on the open d file, where black's pieces, his knights were on c5 and c6 active, his rook on the open file, bishop was coming to f6, and now look. Well,
Instead of queen h5, how about knight h7 too?
Oh, knight h7 would also, yeah, knight h7 would be good too. This is a very, yeah, that would, I mean, win the queen for 2 pieces, so that would be sufficient as well. Yeah. So black played g6. Yeah, if rook takes d5, also queen h5 would be the same thing. And then in that case, then h6, knight takes h6 check would transpose to what we just saw. So like rook takes d5, queen h5. With transpose after h6, knight takes. So black played g6. What does white do now? Let's see if someone can find the winning combination. Knight h7. We want to start with knight h7. Now here he has to he definitely saw the end at this point. And it didn't take him long, I'm sure, because this is not really that hard of a combination. But the real thing was the sense of the position, knowing from earlier that white's position would spring into activity in such a way. So black had to take. What now? We need to have a good follow-up to this. I don't think that there's more than one win. I didn't check carefully. There might be, could be the case, but I doubt it. Because black has rook takes d5 coming, like after queen g4 or something. Mm-hmm. Knight e7, clearing the way. Black's queen is under attack, so I mean he can give up the queen for 2 pieces, but instead he took, and now the queen comes up to h5 with tempo, and black, well, see the pawn is pinned, so king g7, queen h6 leads to the same thing. King has to go to g8. Obviously, king f6, bishop g5 would be made. If white would do this, king g8 would lead to the same thing, and this would be checkmate. So black played immediately king g8, and now next move shouldn't be too hard, right? Anyone? Queen h6, probably black can defend with bishop f6 and bishop g7. Yeah, we're going to sack the bishop, of course. So mate is threatened on h7. Black has to take the bishop. Queen takes. King h8. And finally, not a draw. Rook takes e7, and black resigns because mate is coming. So if we just look at earlier in the game, this position, look at how this developed. Look at the position. It almost looks like white's playing some kind of, well, it's not a hedgehog, but his pieces are only up to the 3rd rank. Black has all of this activity, pressure on the weak d3 pawn, but there was something hidden in the position, as we can see, that can be found, that's proven by the tactics. I think it's pretty convincing what happened. That meant that white had a decisive attack, and part of it is the absence of the knight from f6. Part of it is this strong knight on e3. This knight is very well placed. It's coming to f5. Black has basically spent. He played too ambitiously. I think what I would have some trouble with is, while choosing maybe knight e3. Yeah, I mean, this is, and then d4. This is. But the key point is little tactics with this knight f5 and so on. And then you see that just from here, this is move 15, and now we have. Oops, I don't know how to go. Okay. And then, oops, and bishop d2. And finally, we get this position only a few moves later, 6 moves later. Look at what a difference. Okay, so now I'm going to show I don't know how I think I can open up a new one with this. I'm going to show one of my games, and well, it's easier to show your own games. It's you know them very well, so I think it's more effective. And we've played a few tournaments since this whole thing happened, and it's been a little hard coming back. So I haven't played a lot of good games, but at least in my last tournament, I played one. And okay, so this I had black. This was last weekend in a tournament in Ohio, and my opponent was a young master named Posthuma. I forgot his first name, starts with a J. He's a 2470 or something like that, so it's not a bad player, but I think he didn't show his ability in this game because he got a bad position out of the open. He just didn't know the opening very well, but I think it shows some decision making as far as pursuing the initiative with making intuitive decisions. So I had black, d4, knight f6, c4, g6. I went into King's Indian, knight c3, bishop g7, e4. Let's see if I can close this thing so we can see the notation. Yeah, e4, d6, f3. So this is a Zemish variation. I like to play against this variation. It's a ambitious system for white, and the play is quite varied. Black has a number of systems that are promising against it. Of course, white's aiming for an advantage, and people like this to play this as white as well. But personally, I like to play against Zemish. So I played what I've been playing for a few years, castles. He played bishop e3, and I played this little move a6. So I used to play a system with a6 and c6 called the Byrne system, named for one of the Byrne brothers. I don't remember which one. But I eventually, well, there's some small problems with that. I guess it was playable, but I eventually chose a different setup. So after queen to d2, knight b to d7. This is, the idea is basically to play, well, black keeps flexibility. So sometimes we can go back to that Byrne system with c6 and b5, but also the main idea is to go c5, and when white plays d5, we play b5 in the style of a Benko gambit. And still in some cases, black could play e5 here. Not usually, but it could happen. And now my opponent played knight h3. So one of the kind of dogmas of the Zemish is that if black plays knight to d7 early on, the knight should go to h3 and then to f2, because it can be well placed there and it stays out of the way of the light squared bishop, rather than going to e2, and then from e2 sometimes it has to go to c1, or it might go to g3, in which case on g3 it's covered by the g6 pawn, but on h3 it can go to f2 and it's out of the way. But here it makes the Benko gambit approach very more promising, because that knight is so far away from the queen side, and probably will have to move again because I might take it with my bishop later on. So I played c5 here. There's interesting what is being played, and what I played a couple of years ago after knight e2. There's a completely crazy move here, which is a very good move actually. And normally before, people were playing c6, and it would transpose to a Byrne system with white committed to knight e2. Maybe black extracts some advantage from that, I'm not sure. Or black would play c5, and then we would get that Benko type position, but with the knight on e2, and it's better placed there for that. But recently, this move has been played a lot, and I played it in a tournament in 2018. So I think it started to be played in about 2017. Actually, it was played in 2014 by the Swedish player Tiger Hillar Persson. So I think he might have invented it. Someone had played it earlier, but low-rated player, but he played after white captured something like knight to b6. But the real idea was that black just takes back. Knight takes. And we just play c6. Knight c3. And then e5. And we get like a normal position, basically. Looks like a normal position. But white has the extra pawn on the queen side. And might even end up, in some cases, getting two connected passed pawns when black c pawn gets traded in some cases. But in reality, it's not a very normal position. And somehow this is very promising for black, this variation, because white has spent two moves with his knight, and now the c pawn is gone from c4. So black is going to break open the center with d5. So for instance, in my game, my opponent went knight g3. Well, he has to develop somehow. There's some other options, but this is what he played. And then I went d5. This is not my game that I'm showing. This is just some other game. And here it's really hard to tell, but some analysis and also some intuition has determined that black's attack is strong enough. And I think there's probably been some input from computer engines as well in this analysis, because it's fairly recent. But I think 2014, they were not finding this kind of idea. Computers couldn't. I think that's humans found the idea. But in any case, like for instance, my opponent took here, and I could just take back with my knight, and it might have actually been better on d5. This is good for black. Oddly enough, this position, the white has two connected passed pawns on the queen side, and it seems like he's just going to castle. If he manages to just play bishop e2 and castles, and black does nothing, then black will be lost. White seems to hold d4, but now I think, well, there's h5 is one move, or just queen f6. Oh, sorry, black took back. After bishop e2, white has to develop queen f6, for instance. And strangely enough, well, d4 is under attack, and rook d1 would drop the a pawn, and then black's rook would be well placed. So if white takes here, knight takes back. Now if bishop d4, there's knight takes f3, and black will win back the pawn and get the two bishops after queen takes d4, and that will be very strong in the open board like this, and b2 pawn will be lost soon after. But if white castles, okay, that's normal. Then comes knight c4. Black threatens a lot of things, so white has to take the knight. And then you get this position. Still down a pawn. But black is a little bit better here. White's fighting for a draw, basically. That pawn on b2, white has to try to hold that, and it's not going to be so easy. The pawn on c4 is cramping him. White's pawns are going nowhere. So for instance, bishop e6 and rook f to b8 is coming, or maybe the rook will come on the d file, come to d3 or something like that. There's no chance for black to lose here, and black has good chances that he'll win a pawn back and keep a lot of pressure. So there's a lot of calculation involved in these things. In my game, I actually played this move here, really weird, knight b6, and then the idea is after he takes here, I would take here. And if the queen takes, then queen here, and black threat. Oh, I'm sorry, knight f to d5, I mean. And so the queen is misplaced, and after bishop takes, then there's a check here. And now if the bishop goes, if one of the bishops, or if the bishop or one of the knights go to e2, then knight to c4. King f2, then knight to g4. So he has to go king d1. And now the queen, actually, yeah. There's different ways for black to play here, but white gets in trouble. His pieces get tied up, and it's very tricky, at least. In any case, that was an example of some line that's been developed. It's lot of calculation has to be involved, because clearly in some of those lines, if white could just manage to castle and keep control of the center, he would just have a clear advantage, but it's not the case. And then comes the intuition that whether black has enough or more than enough or not quite enough play for the pawn. Okay, in my game from this last weekend, my opponent went knight h3. And now I played c5, and he went d5. Closing the center. This is typically the way white's going to respond to this. If he didn't take, if he took on c5, how would you take back, by the way, here? I think this is, I don't know if anyone here is a King's Indian player with a knight. I think the knight taking back wouldn't be as accurate. I'm not sure, because about the move e5. It could even be e5, but just simply knight f2 or knight f4. And I think this structure, black doesn't have the activity, doesn't really have activity, and the knight is not doing anything on c5, and white's going to complete his development and have a good Maroczy bind structure. Bishop e2 castles, and then just put pressure down the center without.
The pawn takes lost down.
Yeah, pawn takes is better. Here, even though it looks like it doesn't activate the pieces as much, the structure here matters. And here, white, he doesn't have the Maroczy structure, and black has control of d4. So in the future, he can try to sink a knight into d4, but in any case, he can control d5 by playing e6 if he needs to. And black is just has a good game. For instance, we're going to go probably queen c7 or queen a5, knight e5, and knight eventually to c6, rook to d8, that kind of thing. So this pawn takes would be, I think, the better recapture clearly. If he goes knight f2, that would look like a normal move if you don't want to play d5 and allow Benko type position. But here, a good way to play is just queen a5 first. And if he goes d5 now, then b5, like in the game, the queen still goes to a5 in that. If white continues trying to keep the tension in the center, hoping that black will take, and then we'll get the Maroczy structure. Here, black can actually do that, and he gets a good version of this much better version than what we saw here. The knight goes to e5, and then bishop d7, and next is going to come b5, and also rook f to c8, and sometimes knight c6 driving the bishop, like after b3, which b3 is inevitable. We might have some knight c6, and white already will have tactical problems on the long diagonal because the bishop will have to go to e3. So, but also mainly black's going to be playing b5, and once we get that move, then black has good position. So that's so basically he played d5, which is almost automatic. And now if I play some, I don't know, random move, there's not really anything to play here other than b5, and that's the purpose of black's play. But if I don't play b5, he's going to go a4, and I will have a bad kind of Benoni. So I played b5. And now he took, and then there's a specific setup to activating the pieces here on the queen side. First, queen a5. The idea is queen comes here, putting pressure on the queen side, and only then knight will come to b6. I'm not going to e5 because the knights will get tripping over each other a little bit. I'm going to go knight b6, and maybe the other knight will go to d7, and then possibly to e5 later. But for now, this knight from d7 will go to b6. So this is essentially a Benko gambit. And my opponent now played a4, which is a little bit of a typical move that somehow white usually plays. If he just takes here, for instance, then the bishop could take. And this is a very good version of the Benko gambit because this knight on h3 is far away. White's also played the move f3, which weakened himself a little bit. Queen usually probably doesn't go to d2 in that, and basically black is quite a bit ahead of the Benko. Now rook f to b8 is coming. If white takes here, then the queen would take. Now if white wants to castle, he has to trade queens. And that's perfectly fine. We can allow that in the Benko. We could play either queen takes c2 or rook f to b8 and go into the ending where black is down a pawn, but there's great pressure on white's queen side. And now the next knight is coming to b6 and then to c4 or maybe even to a4 to trade off white's knight. This knight from e8 or from f6 can go to e8 and then to c7 and then to b5. There's other things possible as well, but black has great pressure here. So my opponent played a4. And now I win knight b6. So I'm not taking on b5 yet because that helps him develop. I want him to take, or at least to move his bishop before I take. And now normal, what I think was normal, I expected was knight f2, because most people are afraid of letting the bishop take that knight and force white to take with a pawn, and then his king has no shelter and he's weakened his pawn structure. And then here there's different ways to play knight f to d7. I think you can also take on b5, and then after bishop takes b5, bishop d7. One of the problems white has is the c4 square. If the bishops are exchanged, the knight comes into c4 or threatens to come into c4, and it's very awkward for white to stop that. So for instance, castle's bishop can take b5, and then if pawn takes, then we sacrifice the queen for the rooks, and then black is better there. So anyway, well, there's some ways white can play. I think bishop, I think some, yeah. He takes a knight to d1, but in any case, I think it's pretty promising for black. So, but he played this move rook a3, which is also a little bit normal in these positions because now the rook is protected. But I thought here it wasn't so good, and I took on h3, and I guess this was probably the right decision. He took back. Of course, I give up the light squared bishop. This is important, but I think I gained a lot by breaking up the king side and leaving the white king without a home. And now this knight on f6 is not doing anything. So I need to move this somewhere. Where should I go with that knight? Any ideas? Yeah, d7. Yeah. So the idea is clear. I want to go to e5. From e5, it's of course threatening fork on f3, but also it's going into c4. It's helping the other knight to go to c4. And I've opened up my bishop from g7. So here he played f4 as I expected. My opponent used a lot of time somewhere earlier trying to, actually no, in the next move. But in any case, f4 was pretty clear at the time, but now looking at it, he should have tried to force the exchange of queens by knight to d1. This would have given white, well, white would be holding on. It wouldn't be that easy, but the idea is, well, now the queen is threatened, so I have to trade on d2. Taking on b5 doesn't help me. So take, and then bishop takes. And then if knight e5, f3 is guarded by the rook, and so he has something like b takes a6. Well, it's not so clear, right? We got that pawn. And if I take on b5, I can take on b5. And then he needs to take with the bishop, because if pawn takes, then I can trade rooks and play rook a8. Takes with a bit. So if pawn takes, the rook takes a3, b takes a3, rook a8, and I'm going to win the pawn on a3. Bishop takes. And now I can play knight e5 followed by f5. Basically, my plan is f5 at some point. I think this is, actually, I think I wrote something down here. Actually, I can, oh, that's my new one. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't write anything down. In any case, f5 is coming, and okay, black has compensation, but it's tricky. And with f5 coming, the white king is never going to be safe. The pieces are pretty active, but still, white has the 2 bishops, and he has the passed a pawn, so it's not so clear. So that's how he should have played, but he played f4, which at the time looked very natural. Stopping knight e5, it seems like that's such a big threat. And now there comes a very unpleasant move for white, queen b4. And the queen is exerting pressure now horizontally. So the main threat is I'm going to actually take on c3 and then take on e4. Usually you don't want to give up this dark squared bishop, but it's not good to be dogmatic, and it takes a lot of judgment. Sometimes you don't even want to win a whole rook by giving up this bishop. Sometimes it might be worth it to win a pawn. Like here, this is a big threat. For instance, if he takes on a6, I would take here. And then let's say rook takes, because if queen takes, then he doesn't even have bishop g2. Rook takes, queen takes. And white's position is full of weaknesses, and his king will never find safety. Whereas I'm not missing, my king is not going to come under attack here. So for instance, bishop g2, then I can come back and take this pawn. Now knight c4 is the idea. If I can remove his dark squared bishop also. I'm ready to take the pawn on a6. And every one of his pawns is weak. And also I'll have an extra one, or I already do. No, I'm going to be taking one of his on a6, for instance. So, yeah. So that's the threat. And if he plays a5, oops. If he plays a5, anyone see what black does here? He wants to just establish the passed pawn with b6. Pawn takes pawn, yeah. I think knight c4, I don't see a refutation of it yet, but it's probably not as good as, I mean, takes b6, bishop c3, but it's not as good as a takes b5. So a takes b5. If the knight takes on b5, I can take on e4, hitting the rook on h1. If the bishop takes back, I have, well, rook takes a5, or I have maybe bishop c3, but it doesn't look like that works. So, but if he takes here, key variation is I take here, pawn takes. Wait a second. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I take here, pawn takes, and I take the knight. And then if he takes here, threatening my knight, I have this move, in between move, threatening bishop c3. So he doesn't have time to take the knight. So I win that pawn on a3, and then I take the pawn on b6 as well. And then black's winning, because we have extra pawn, and the structure is also perfect for black and terrible for white. So that was, couldn't play a5. So my opponent thought a long time, and he found a good move, king f2. And now is a tough, well, first I took on b5. This much was clear. He's threatening now to play a5, because that variation may not work now with the king on f2. Also, he might take on a6. So it was clear that I should take this. He has to take with the bishop. And now, what should black do here? What is the choice that I'm trying to make? there was two moves that I thought were possible, and it was very hard to choose between them. So we can have sort of a candidate move problem. Sometimes you look at the position and, well, I don't know what to think about. We start just thinking, okay, what moves are possible here that make any sense? And then it starts to become a little bit easier to think. Yeah?
Bishop
Bishop
takes
takes c3. Yeah, so that was my original plan. Bishop takes c3. Do I want to do it with his king on f2? There's some differences because his rook can come into the game. So that was one choice, was to take on c3. Is there any other move that black could play? It makes sense. I mean, there's lots of moves I could play. I could go rook e8, but it wouldn't make sense, right? Knight to c4, yeah. So that we would, with that move, we would force him to exchange off his light squared bishop and sort of crystallize a clear advantage for black, because it's clearly a very good benko after that. Takes, queen takes. Now I'm again really threatening bishop takes c3, because with only one bishop, I would be very clear on that position. And I've just clarified things. He has no light squared bishop, so I think it's just a clearly good benko. So I spent a long time thinking about this position. Probably not thinking too well, because, well, not very good form in general, but both moves are good, and this is hard to make a decision. And I thought they were both winning, but sometimes when you're thinking that you have two ways to win, like 80% of the time, that's not true. One of them is clearly better than the other one, or more than 80%, I don't know. And sometimes it's one of them that doesn't work. More than often it happens that when you're thinking you have multiple ways to win, really only one way wins. So, but in this case, they really were both good moves. And I think I made a good decision when I went knight c4. I wanted to keep it simple, because here I was sure that I was clearly better and I had some ideas how the play was going to go. But bishop takes c3, the position transforms a lot more, and it was very hard to really be absolutely sure, because there's a lot of tactics, and not tactics, but a lot of things going on. And I have a danger that if I don't achieve something really significant on the king side and center, like winning multiple pawns or checkmating him, that he always has two bishops and a passed a pawn. His bishop will come to c6, so there's always some danger. So he would have to take with his queen, because if the rook takes, then knight f6 would be winning. So he would, because now the pawn on e4 would be a fork, whatever he does, or at least he would have to give up the light squared bishop. So he would take with the queen, and then I would take here, and then I have to consider rook d1 or rook e1. Well, rook e1 I take on d5, but I thought rook d1. And now one thing that's possible to overlook is knight takes d. Well, it doesn't from advance from before. Well, rook takes d5 suddenly, and white's winning, or at least much better, because then the bishop takes d7, winning two pieces for rook. Okay, that's pretty obvious, but you can get confused a little bit. So I was looking at knight f6. Now the pawn on d5 is falling, but what's really going on after bishop c6? It's pretty hard to assess, although it's actually very good for black. Knight takes d5, in fact. And I was not sure about this, because for one thing, white can actually take the rook, but also the queen could move, and then my knight is pinned. I don't know. I mean, white's king is open, but he has two bishops, and his rook defends along the third rank, and well, it's very good for black. Even after he takes the rook, just take back, and apparently, well, I have very good position, because his position is riddled with weaknesses, and my knights are strong, and he's weak on the light squares. But it's hard to make this assessment from several moves before, and I decided to go with a simpler course. Knight c4. So he has to take it because his rook and queen are both under attack. Queen takes. Now I threaten bishop takes c3. There was no question that I want to take the bishop or take the knight and the e pawn. If it's my move here, when he's traded off his light squared bishop, there's no doubt in my mind that I can give up my my bishop and take the pawn on e4 and be clearly winning. I'm not worried about that position, but with the light squared bishop still on the board, it's a little bit more tricky. So he has to defend against that, and he played queen c2, which was not really what I expected, but it's hard to give advice. I thought he was going to go queen e2, because if I trade queens, it's not so clear. He might be able to hold. I certainly have a good benko, but not so clear. So I was going to do this. Again, threatening bishop takes c3. And also f5 is coming. And if queen b5, I can take on c3 again. And then take on e4 in the next move, hitting the rook on h1. So this also looks bad for white, but he played queen c2. Okay, what does black play here? This was an interesting moment. We got still down a pawn, right? Yeah, still down a pawn. But it's white's got some weaknesses. E4, A, and the H pawns, and also his B pawn and his A pawn in some cases even. But we need to be accurate and find a way to develop the initiative and not let him consolidate. So what are our candidate moves? Yeah, one of the rooks to b8. I mean, that's move that I mean, I didn't really think about it because, well, it's certainly a candidate move, but f5 is I want my rook on the f file maybe. I don't want to move rook a to b8, and I don't think b2 is really going to be the target here. It's a benko gambit, so sometimes it could be, but it's not here because there's more important things going on. That pawn can be guarded, and it's not the best thing I can achieve here. So rook f to b8, yeah, maybe. What else? You said f5. F5 is a very important structural move in the benko gambit positions, undermining white's center, and it exposes the d5 pawn as a weakness, and it also, in this case, because I'm very lucky, I got a great position, his king even comes into the firing line. So I did play f5. There are also moves like bishop takes c3, which I considered for a while. I think I spent a while before deciding on f5 because it seemed like f5 was the most intuitive move, but it seemed like maybe maybe it gave him some chances. But bishop takes c3, I wasn't very convincing. I wanted to try to immediately force the issue, but it wasn't so clear. Knight here, he can play king f3 even, I guess. Oh, then knight takes d5, but yeah. Oh, no, then queen e4. So knight takes d5 doesn't work. So it wasn't so clear. And here, okay, I could try using some position. I could play f5 here, but I didn't want to give up that. I don't need to trade off the knight, so my bishop immediately. So f5 was, I think, the best move. And now he took on f5. My opponent was slow on time here, and I was more afraid he was going to play a5 because it was a lot more tricky. He wanted the idea of rook a4 to drive my queen back. If he manages to drive my queen back, then not that his position would be great, but at least he has some chances to defend. So I wasn't so sure. Because now instead of getting a clear attack on him for sort of easier to play moves, I have to make some decisions about going into the ending. So I would take here. And he has to play rook a4 here, what I thought. Because if queen takes, then it's like the game actually. Then I play knight e5. I think knight e5. I could also take on b2 or take and rook f to b8. But I think knight e5 I want to activate the knight. And bring the knight to c4. If he trades queens, knight comes to c4, it's just devastating in this kind of position. I win all of his pawns practically. So this would be bad, but a rook a4 and rook a4, and now I was looking at this move. And I was just a little bit loath to go into the ending, if this kind of ending, if I could, but this is definitely very good for black. I have I have G5 coming, those kinds of moves. I also have Rook F to B8 coming. It's just weaknesses everywhere. But at the time thinking about it, well, it was a little bit, looked like better defensive chances. But he took on F5. Rook takes F5. And now Queen E2. He played trying to, well, now I threaten many things, like Knight E5 is coming, Rook takes F4, this kind of thing. So he went Queen E2. So I again use a chance to activate my knight, Knight E5. If he trades queens, it's just very bad for white, because the knight attacks everything. F4, B2, A3. My only problem is which to take first, like Rook A2. I could, probably the simplest way is just to take on B2, because there's no chance white can hold this ending. I mean, it's because now I'm going to get either A4 or D5, probably eventually both of them. And then I will have an extra pawn and he'll still have many more weaknesses. So I wasn't concerned about that. So he played queen, so he played, just like a knight E5. He played A5 now. So now he saw the A5 idea and Rook A4. In any case, it's his only chance is to try to do something. So here, what does black play? This is where there was, yeah, what do you think? You have this in the tournament game, and I spent some time on my decisions, especially Knight C4. So I wasn't totally out of, with no time shortage myself. There was only one time control for the whole tournament, like game in 100 or something. So I had, I don't remember, maybe 20 minutes or something here, 15. My opponent 4 or 5 minutes. But let's suppose you have this in a tournament game. What are you thinking about?
Queen exchange followed by knight C4.
Queen takes followed by knight C4 is a simple path, right? It's a simple path, and we lead to a pretty clearly better ending. I was a little like thinking it's not so clear after takes and then knight C4. Gosh. Oops. I was thinking maybe it's not so clear after takes, knight C4, Rook A2, and now if I take the pawn on B2, knight B5. I mean, I was sure that black is winning, but well, now his A pawn is going somewhere. Maybe knight C7 will come at some point. I can't take on D5 yet. His pawn gets to A6. He's got some play. I don't have to take on B2. Probably I could take on A5 with a positionally winning game. But then again, it's going to go on. I mean, I could play Rook takes A5 trade. He trades, and then Rook A1, knight back to C4. And he's got weaknesses all over the board, but that was a practical way of playing. But if you can force a win, you want to try to find it. Is there any other candidate move here for black beside? What's that? Oh, knight D3? Yeah, there's knight D3. I think I looked at that, but the problem is king moves, I guess, probably here, and my knight is pinned, so I'm not sure I can really achieve anything with that. My knight is pinned, and also his rook is on A3, is also starting to menace it a little bit. So that's,
well, combination with the bishop takes knight now.
Bishop takes, but then rook takes, and then the queen is under attack, and also the knight. And so it doesn't look like it's, well, even here there's yeah, knight takes queen. So there's knight, so it doesn't look like it's, yeah, we're going to lose the, yeah, queen takes D5. I mean, even here maybe there's some then it starts to come rook d1, because this is under attack, but rook d1.
No, I was thinking draw the queen back on the a-file.
Yeah, but then white will take the knight. If queen goes back a6, queen a6 or somewhere, then queen takes.
Well, you can.
Yeah. I mean, knight d3, I didn't look at very much. I probably glanced, but I just saw, okay, there's nothing after he moves his king because my knight is stuck there. It's pinned, and it's not. I can't just take f4 because my knight is pinned. So, but that's certainly one of the candidate moves. Anything else?
You have to check rook takes pawn.
Rook takes pawn, definitely. This now that's a good question. If I didn't have very much time left, I might not. It might, like in a blitz game, it might not be. Depends on your level of intuition. My intuition wasn't immediately saying, well, this is obviously winning. I had to calculate a bit. In fact, I looked at it for a minute, and then I said, oh, it probably doesn't work. And then I said, well, I'll probably have to just trade queens and win the ending. But then I came back to it, and I said, oh, then I saw another idea. Really, I mean, I think you can make this move by intuition, but you really shouldn't, because black has a clearly winning ending after queen e2, knight c4, and then just taking the a pawn, and then white's pawns everywhere are weak. But rook takes f4 was what I played, and it was the right move because it forces a win. He has to take it. If he doesn't, well, then I can trade queens and go into the ending with another pawn, and I'll still get the rook will come to b4, and so he has to take it. Queen takes. Now he has two possibilities, basically. I mean, king g1, knight f3 doesn't look good, but he could go king g2 or king e1. And king g2, I could check on g5 and then rook f8, and he still has to go to e1 then. So I left that for last in my calculations. So I first looked at king e1, and then I looked at knight f3, and he has to go to d1 because otherwise I win his queen with knight to d4 if he goes to the f file. And now what? This is where when I first looked at it, I said, oh, okay, his king walks away, probably doesn't work, then I probably have to trade queens. Then I briefly came back to it, and I realized there's another move here, that there's a move for black, an idea, let's say. What does black play? Excellent, bishop h6, yeah. The bishop, which was doing a lot of work on the long diagonal before, can do better work now in this position here. And it looks a little bit like random circumstance, but he can't run away to c2 because knight d4 forks the queen. And not only that, he has a check on e6, but it turns out that he still will be forked with knight to d4 if he runs with his king to either e2 or c2. I can't let him get king c2 and bring his king to a2, obviously, and then that's the most important thing to check by calculation. But he can't do it, and mate is threatened on d2. And queen c1 is also threatened, so there's no way here to defend. So he didn't give the check on e6. And this is actually what happened, but he has to guard against queen c1 mate, and it's not as easy as it seems. What would you first look at if you were calculating this as black here? Rook a1, right? So rook a1 was my first calculation, and then I saw, well, I can take on a5, but first I'm going to make his queen. I want to play this move because I like how the knight and bishop are going to work to cover all of the squares on the second rank. And I see that the queen will now have to move to a very passive square on g2, because if queen d3, always queen d3, there was a c4 move. And the queen has no way to keep guarding everything. It has to guard f3 and d2. Queen e4 is not possible because mate on d2, for instance. So he would have to go queen g2, and then there would be rook takes a5, diverting the rook. So he would have to go rook b1. And around here, I stopped my calculation because I said black's position must be winning here. And there's multiple wins, but I actually looked one more move, knight f5. So at the minimum, I have knight f5, and there's no way to stop the check on e3 coming. King e2 is met by queen to d2, or queen to d2, the other moves also. Knight e3, and he could give back to exchange, but it would be lost. I'm sure there's some better way to win here too, even queen f. Queen f5 with idea of queen d3, for instance. But knight f5 minimum. So I stopped looking there. It doesn't. And I remembered that my rook needs to be on the A file, because maybe it's not so clear if my rook's on f8. So that's why I was okay. When I have to come back to the king g2 variation, because he can divert my rook to f8. We'll see if there's a difference. I didn't think there could be. I also saw that he has some other funny move here that he actually played. Can anyone see it? Knight a2. This move is like, well, this is a little hard to see, but my opponent found that move. That's there's no other way to defend, because if he moves his queen, I check and just take his rook. Or if queen to g2, then I can play minimum knight to d4 and transpose to what we just saw. Or even better, after queen g2, I can just take his queen right away with queen c1 and queen takes b2. And so he played knight a2. What does black do now? Rook's attack. An important thing to notice: the rook on the third rank. That was something that made me think, okay, I have to be careful going into this, because there's always some possibility that the rook comes over. Any ideas? Yeah, knight to d4, and yeah, it's that knight is just working with the bishop so well. So queen is under attack, and I did notice things like little things that you have to notice. For instance, rook f1 is never going to work because the queen is always protected. So knight e2, rook f4, knight f4, and I'm up a piece, and there's no hope for him there. And here, queen d3, again, there's a c4 move, and the queen has nowhere to go. If queen c3, then minimum knight b5. There's, yeah, minimum knight b5. There's also other, probably queen e4. But yeah. So after knight d4, he has to guard his queen, and he has to keep d2 guarded, and also, yeah, it's not so easy to do. So he went g2, the only other move with the queen. Now, how does black play? This is probably multiple good moves, but it's not so simple, because he's got rook f1 coming, and then the rook is defending on the third rank. Rook's where? F8. Rook f8. Yeah, well, let's see. What is the idea, though? Stops rook f1, but it might be that black even here has just such a dominating position that we can spend a tempo like this doing not really doing anything, but white just doesn't have any moves. Yeah, I mean, it's probably even here black is in control after if you give the move to white, essentially, or without allowing rook f1. So yeah, it's hard to find a defense here for white. Maybe he plays a6, and then we still have to find figure out what we're doing now. Queen. So I don't need rook f8, because I play queen f5. Now the queen on f4 was not doing anything, but it was going to come in to b1, and that's a big threat. And the coordination of the knight covering e2 and c2, and the bishop covering d2, this is working very well. And the sense of harmony of those pieces said, well, okay, this should be good for black. This should be winning. I mean, for black, not just a question of good either. So clearly, queen b1, he can't run with his king, because king e1, queen b1, and then I take b2 with check and at least win his rook. So he has to interpose on c3. And he's going to need to play rook c3. I think he started with knight c1. Doesn't really matter, because it's going to reach the same position either way. Yeah, you start with knight c1. anticipating queen b1, which I then played. And now the only way to guard the knight is rook c3, because these squares e2, d2, c2, all these squares are under control. Rook's, oops. Rook c3. And now, what does black play here? Make a small decision, but it's easy to make by calculation. Any ideas? Yeah, that was the first thing that popped into my head. I mean, I didn't calculate this far. I think my intuition was just kind of, well, white's obviously lost. But this was first thing that popped into my head when the position arose on the board, and then queen d3. And that was clearly going to be very good for black, because he would have to go to the f file, and then I would have rook f8, and he's going to get discovered check no matter what. But it wasn't necessary to calculate that, because I have another option, which was clearly better, because it forces a very clear win. And we have to just look at a kind of calculation where we're just checking if the opponent can do anything. What I played was just rook takes a5. And now my plan is simple. I'm going to go rook a1 and then sacrifice the queen on c1, because his king can't get off of the second rank. All I have to do is check that he has no counterattack. So for instance, queen g4, rook a1, e6 square is guarded. He can give one check here, but that's just a spite check after king g7. There's no more checks and no way to stop queen takes c1. If he moves his king, I'll just take with the bishop on c1, and then everything is over that way too. So rook takes a5 and rook a1, and it's funny, it takes a couple of moves to carry out this threat, but there's no defense for white. So he played actually rook f1, rook a1, and then he was a good sport and let me carry out the checkmate. He played queen f2. Obviously he knew what was coming, but there's no defense. King e1, I would just take the knight with the bishop, and then he still can't get off the back rank, because then I'll take the pawn on b2 with check if king f2. So he played queen f2, threatening mate in 3, but I played queen takes c1 first, and then it was like this. Then finally, when I calculated, I looked at some things like that. Not every single thing, of course. I didn't. When I made the rook takes f4, certainly didn't see that finish of the game. But there was some element of, well, white's clearly has no moves in this position, and it should be winning for black. But then I went back quickly after seeing the idea of bishop h6 and then knight f3, knight d4, and the rook takes a5. To check that there wasn't any big difference if he first goes king g2 and then back here, and then in order to achieve something, I might have queen g3. Well, then he goes king d1. So no, anyway, rook f8. I saw that I just checked quickly, because this is not very. It seems to help black to bring the rook to f8 minimum. And we get to this position, and here. Still same thing, and if rook a1, the only position where maybe I want my rook on a8, because I want rook takes a5, but here it doesn't change anything, because here again he has to choose between d3 and g2, and I now have also queen h5, not in this position, queen h5, but sorry, queen g2 is not possible, of course, because the queen's hanging, but the only move is queen d3, and then I have queen h5. So that's queen on g5 also is, and then it's just rook f3 coming as well. So that was, I think, some well, it's the only good game I've played recently that I could show, basically. And yeah, trying to show some intuition and calculation in attacking, how much of it we what portion of our play is from intuition, what portion is from calculation. Anyone have any questions? No.
Thank you, Bryan, for coming in tonight. Thank you, everyone, for also coming. Welcome to sing a little bit. What's your next turn?
What is it? I think I'm playing in the Atlantic Open.
Oh.
Or Washington DC. Not sure though. Sure. What's that? Well, I was in Vienna 2019.